Hello, welcome to Mr. B's Biology. Today we're looking at histology of thick skin. This is a human sample plantar. So again, recall plantar means essentially the bottom of your foot. And these slides, obviously, as always, I get from the University of Michigan School of Medicine's website. So fantastic website. Definitely recommend using that if you're preparing, for example, for a lab practical. So very helpful. All right, so right off the bat, the thing I always make sure my students are aware of is that to really kind of master histology, if you will, one of the first things you should be acquainted with is kind of seeing how very often things stain to different degrees, different colors, etc. And that is very helpful because then you can start to see some landmarks that really start to stand out. Great example right before us right here, because thick skin, as we can see, has these different layers that really do stand out. The first layer that we can see is this dark purple layer. It's kind of thin, but it stains really dark purple. And this is the epidermal layer. So I'm going to denote that with an E here. All right, below that is kind of a rosy, kind of deep rosy pink color, if you will. And that deep rosy pink color, which also stands out, is going to be the dermis. Put that with a D. Then we see a really large area. There's some little striated things kind of in here, little squiggly lines, connective tissue, blood vessels, etc. And we also see a lot of kind of whitish pink area, open area, and particularly the open area are the adipose cells. So one of the kind of definitive features of this particular layer is the fact that we see adipose cells present at varying degrees, depending on the concentration of body fat, for example, of that individual. So this layer is the hypodermis, the hypo-D as I'm going to call it. It's also referred to as the subcutaneous. Very often, as you probably are aware of at this point, anatomy and physiology loves to use various terms. I try to be consistent, especially when it follows suit with other things. So to me, hypodermis is the best way to call this because we have an epidermis, we have a dermis, now we have a hypodermis. So being consistent. So hypodermis, or perhaps your professor likes to call it the subcutaneous. They're the same thing. Last thing we can see here is we actually have some skeletal muscle as well, which is pretty cool. So we got some skeletal muscle. We're not going to obviously focus on that today. I will do a skeletal muscle. I would like to actually do a comparison of skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, because that also is very helpful, and it's often something you might see on a lab practical. So that'll be for another time. Here we're going to focus on particularly the epidermis, but I want to show these other layers first. All right. So one thing to talk about here regarding the dermal layer, first, how you can kind of separate the end of the epidermis as it meets the dermal layer. As we see, we have all these kind of little prominent ridges, these papillary ridges kind of projecting like little fingers into the dermis. All right, so this is the epidermis. And then, of course, everything beyond that is all dermis. But with that said, the dermis has kind of two definitive layers. And it may not seem so definitive at first. And the reason why there's these two layers is really about particularly what kind of connective tissue are we looking at here. So this first layer kind of, in my opinion, stains a little bit lighter pink. We do see there are nucleated cells kind of thrown in this mix, but the area I really want to focus on is this kind of lighter pink area, this papillary layer. So this will be the papillary layer. I'm just going to put PAP. All right, change colors there, make it a little bit lighter. All right, so that's the papillary layer. All right, and the papillary layer consists of primarily areolar connective tissue. All right, areolar connective tissue, you're probably going to see this come up a lot, especially when you start looking at mucosal layers and especially lamina propria with the different types of organs, because very often that lamina propria, what you're seeing is a lot of areolar connective tissue in that area. Okay, so going beyond that area, going deep, is another layer, the predominant layer of the dermis, and this is the reticular layer. And the reticular layer consists of dense irregular tissue. or dense irregular connective tissue. Okay. All right, so papillary layer closest to this region with these papillary ridges, and that consists mainly of areolar connective tissue. And of course, that reticular layer, the thicker layer of the dermis, the denser layer, if you will, which is dense irregular connective tissue. All right. So with the hypodermis layer, there's a lot of different things can be seen in here. There's obviously large blood vessels, there's connective tissue, there's nerve cells, etc. But for me, what really stands out is the fact that obviously we see adipose cells. And adipose cells, I always liken them to soap bubbles. If you were to kind of see soap bubbles forming in a bubble bath, for example, you often see them kind of growing and they get really large, these kind of open spaces. They look like soap bubbles in my opinion. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's one way I can kind of determine whether I'm looking at an adipose cell. So hypodermis, big predominant feature of the hypodermis is the fact that we have all this adipose tissue with these adipose cells. All right. Okay, now on to the star here, because what we really want to focus on is the epidermis. All right, so with the epidermis, again, there's different layers that stand out, but at first they may not stand out very well, so you kind of have to know what you're looking for. Because we're looking at thick skin, there is one area, at least in my opinion, that tends to stand out very well, and that's this layer right here. You see this kind of clearish, typically it has this light purple to light blue coloration. All right, it's translucent. You could say maybe there's a pun in there. It's translucent because it contains the stratum, or it is, I should say, the stratum lucidum. So nice when they choose terms that make sense. So it's lucid, it's translucent, it's clearish looking. So stratum lucidum that contains mostly proteins, particularly proteins that are derived from the keratohyalin that's produced in the granular sites. All right. The other layer that's kind of more superficial to that, this really thick area right here, this is the stratum corneum. Now sometimes the use of corneum, this Latin word, makes sense. So if you talk about the cornea, for example, on the hyoid bone, it does kind of look like horns. Here, again, does this look like a corn layer, or a horn layer, I should say, sorry. Maybe these look like horns kind of projecting off. Obviously these dead skin cells are being kind of sloughed off or shed, but corneum refers to typically horn or horn-like. That's the Latin word there. So maybe it makes sense for you, maybe it doesn't, but stratum corneum, this is primarily these keratinocytes that have migrated this far north. And as you can see, we have maybe some nucleated cells, but pretty much most of these are anucleated. So at some point they start to die and they become basically dead cells. And their primary purpose in this case is protection. So they serve as this wonderful protection against potential pathogens and other things in the environment. So this is our first line of defense. If we look below the stratum lucidum here, there is this thin layer of these kind of granular looking cells. All right, so these granular looking cells and this layer here, this is the stratum granulosum. Again, it's great when the nomenclature makes sense because, again, what we're seeing here are these granular cells. They contain all these different granules of keratinohyalin, this particular type of protein that's being manufactured in these cells. And one of the important purposes of this is it's waterproof protein. All right, so they look granular, hence the name stratum granulosum. Okay, next, kind of working our way deeper towards the dermis here. There is a thick layer, about usually 8 to 10 cells thick, of these little spiny looking cells. It's really hard to see this here, but they have these little spiny processes, and they are referred to as the stratum spinosum. So these cells, particularly, especially because of keratinocytes, we've been talking about, these are keratinocytes that are going through different developmental stages as they're migrating further and further to the surface of the skin. These particular cells are named because they have these spiny processes. They have spiny or spiky cytoplasmic processes, so hence the name spiniosum. And again, keratin is a very important intermediate filament, especially with the formation of desmosomes and hemidesmosomes. So this intermediate filament, part of the cytoskeleton of that cell, in this particular case, is creating these spiny processes. All right. The last layer in here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. The last layer to look at that's connected to the dermis here, or at least butts up to the dermis, is a layer of these columnar cells. As you can see, they look very column-like. Okay, and this layer is referred to as the stratum basale. So this layer, these are cells going through mitosis, producing these keratinocytes that are going to go through these different developmental stages as they migrate north, basically, as they migrate towards the surface of the skin. So you have the stratum basale cells that are going through mitotic division, producing these keratinocytes. In the spiniosum, they have these spiny processes. They're also referred to typically as prickle cells because they look very prickly. They get into the stratum granulosum layer. They become more granular. They're producing all these granulars in their cytoplasm. We get beyond the stratum lucidum, and here we get into the stratum corneum. So here we get these cells that are starting to die off and just exist there for the purpose of being protection against the environment and also to help reduce a little bit of water loss as well. All right, so that is the epidermis. Depending on how much detail your professor requests of you, hopefully that was sufficient enough. I plan on making more videos, especially videos about histology, because from personal experience as an anatomy and physiology teacher, I know that very often histology is kind of a weak point for many students. So I hope this is very helpful for you all. And if you are taking a lab practical, good luck.